The tray trembled in Jingian's hands before she realized her fingers were shaking. Steam rose in a pale ribbon from the little bowls. The confinement porridge, the ginger broth, the precisely rolled lotus leaf parcels that she had been taught to prepare the way a daughter-in-law should. The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and milk. A small cradle sat by the window. The baby slept with its face turned away from the light. She had carried more trays than this one. She had carried a husband's reputation, her in-laws' expectations, years of quiet concessions. Tonight, the thing she carried was not only hot food, it was the weight of 10 years of promise and 3 years of ceaseless patient obedience. The door was ajar. He stood in the doorway, sharp in a suit that caught the fluorescent light, hair perfect, jaw set to take in whatever image would preserve him. Shen did not look at the baby. He did not look at the woman in the bed. His eyes found her, and the look in them was a settled calculus. "You know what to do," he said. The words were flat, practiced. "Serve her. Tend to the child. It's only proper." There was a kind of silence after the last syllable, not the soft hush of a room at rest, but the heavy stillness of an accusation that had nowhere to land. The woman on the bed, Chenni, pale, swollen, clutching a perfumed handkerchief, watched as Jingian crossed the floor on the thin carpet like someone moving over a glass sea. The mother-in-law, seated at the window, smiled a small, satisfied curve that said the world had been put back in order. He forced her to serve his ex. The claim, digestible, poisonous, hung in the room like steam. Sue remembered, with a sudden and jolting clarity, the little ritual that used to settle them on hard nights. She would count slowly under her breath while he drove them home from a late meeting, counting the numbers out not to mark time but to lay tracks. 1, she had said once, in the first years when the promises were still small and bright. 2. 10 had been for patience. 1,000 had been for a lifetime. She had thought 1,000 held forever. Now, as she set the tray on the bedside table, her hands steadying, the counting echoed in her mind. She did not voice it. Counting was private. It had been the quiet language in which she had promised to stay. But the numbers that night were like pebbles in her mouth, small, hard, and impossible to swallow. The confinement nurse smiled politely at her, as if she were any other helper. The nurse had been told who would serve the newborn's first full meal. The nurse had signed forms and offered condolences and moved on because the business of maternity wards is to keep moving. A baby cries, someone else steps forward. Life insists. Sue folded the napkin and put the spoon down as if the motion alone could steady something else. Her face gave nothing away. Her throat worked. She had practiced composure for a decade in front of audience after audience, at celebrations, at board dinners where she was expected to be the graceful supporting actor. His world had required polished silence. Tonight, silence would not be enough. She took the tray back, set the bowl to the woman's lips. She watched the child suck. She saw the newborn's tiny fingers wrap unknowingly around an adult's thumb. For a moment, the world contracted to that small, miraculous touch, and then expanded again into a geometry of humiliation. She the server, she the invisible caretaker of a rival's baby, she the unpaid steward of a reputation that had been built, in part, on her shoulders. After she left, his voice followed her down the hall. "Last chance," he said, sharp enough that it would carry. He expected the syllables to do the work of a verdict. At the elevator, Jingian closed her eyes. The numbers began under her breath, not out of devotion now, but as a kind of litany for steadiness. She reached 1,000 somewhere between the guard at the courtyard gate and the taxi's taillights. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer the woman who had carried the tray into that room. She was someone who had just counted to 1,000 and decided that silence was a luxury she could no longer afford. She could have left then. She could have walked away, left the city and taken the secret in her head and the life she had given up somewhere else. But Guming's cage did not only hold her in body, it held a history of small compromises sealed in contracts and signatures, of a patent assignment that glinted like cold metal on a file in the chairman's office, of a house signed over in dowry papers, of a family name that asked price for everything it offered. She thought of the chip schematics tucked between 2 old recipe books at the back of a drawer in her childhood apartment, scribbles she had made in a cramped lab when she was still called Yuani. She thought of the nights where she had sat under fluorescent lights, sketching waveforms and photon paths, fingers stained with flux, smiling at lines of code like a lover. Those were memories she had been taught to hide, to turn into anecdotes at board dinners. "Oh, I tinkered," she would say with a modest laugh. Men had been praised for much less. He had made his fortune with a product called DSPS, an elegant, marketable name for a set of behaviors the world rewarded. It was their company's heart. It was, everyone said, the reason the underwriters were calling for the IPO. The DSPS patent, framed on the wall of the head offices in a gold-edged plaque, had been presented as something corporate, a secured asset, a transfer of rights neatly inked and stamped. It was a claim that kept them afloat and made Gooming a chairman. The truth of it, she had learned, was not so simple. She had watched the company grow, watched Gooming take the speeches, accept the awards. He had been handsome during those years, an image that one could wrap in a tuxedo and present to a room full of cameras. What no one saw were the nights she had been at the bench fixing a prototype, not as a hobby, but because some internal logic in her brain refused to let the product fail. When a chip's heat profile went awry in the final test, she had stayed and reworked the layout, sacrificing sleep, losing promotions she might have taken if she had chosen the traditional route. She had given him a partner who was more tireless than visible. She had built an engine and watched a different man sit in the driver's seat and take the applause. That labor had value. She had been told, by men with suits and impossible smiles, that value could be measured in stock and in social standing. They were all wrong about the measuring. On the ride home, as neon smeared past the taxi glass, she called a number she had kept in case of the very night she found herself done with negotiation. The phone clicked. Then a voice answered on the fourth ring. Fushikin, a name she'd heard for 10 years in the form of quiet constancy. A man who moved more slowly than the rest of the world, who had admired her before admiration became convenient or fashionable. He had been a constant thread in the margins of her life, always in the right place with the right book, always dialing the right number with the exact right timing to pick up a child, or an empty apartment key, or an hour of conversation. "Are you all right?" he asked, and the voice had no surprise. He had expected trouble. People like him always had an angle, but his angle was not sharp. "I will be," she said, because it was true in a way that had nothing to do with comfort. She did not tell him the humiliation in the hospital, not yet. She only said, "I filed." It sounded too simple, and yet it was the most complicated sentence she had ever said. "Good," he said softly. "If you need anything, call me. Don't do anything rash." She thought of the tray, of the way the nurse's hand had brushed the hem of her sleeve as if to say, "This is how it is." She thought of the baby's tiny fist. The world would not stop because she refused to stay small anymore. A week later, the papers were filed. She sat across from a lawyer who had the softness of someone who had switched law for ethics late in life and spread the documents out like a chessboard. Gooming's name looked official on the header, his signature crisp and expected. The prenup clauses had been arranged the way families arranged weddings, quiet mortgaging of autonomy for the illusion of stability. When the divorce papers reached the chairman that Tuesday afternoon, he read them twice. The second time, his face fell into a shade of disbelieving anger that betrayed the calculations beneath. He had been able to buy silences and favors because the world believed in the narrative he sold. It was part of the currency. A divorcing wife was a blip. A divorcing wife who had been the quiet architect of the very thing that made his company valuable was a different kind of problem. The in-laws were quick. The mother-in-law called, voice made of knives she had hidden under cakes for years, and tried to arrange the damage control that family reputations require. Sisters-in-law took sides like they had taken shoes and jewelry, swiftly and with an eye for who benefited. The Gu family's living room became a map of alliances. The house where Jingian had once learned how to fold napkins in the orientation her mother-in-law preferred was suddenly a contested terrain. There were attempts to shame her in public, the curated posts on social platforms, thinly veiled messages from acquaintances. A rumor that she had been unfaithful to the marriage circulated in a closed group with manufactured screenshots of conversations she had never had. The narrative of her as a disloyal woman spread faster than any truth she could immediately set against it. But even as the social machine churned, the corporate one started to clack. The DSPS patent files were not merely symbols. They were documents processed through government offices, assigned numbers, stamped with seals that confirmed legal transfer of intellectual property. Those seals, an old brass stamp from the county patent office that had its own family of indentations, became suddenly important in a way they had not been when framed on a wall. At a board meeting called in the middle of the week that smelled of coffee and cold air conditioner breath, someone mentioned a procedural audit, an internal compliance review that the compliance officer insisted was routine. The underwriters had been nervous about chatter in the industry. The investment banks, always tuned to small frictions that could cascade, had asked for guarantees. When Jingian looked at the DSPS dossier in the chairman's office after hours, because there was a list of things to be done and because the night was quieter than the day, she saw a small irregularity. A stamp impression, partly overlapping an assigned page, did not match the series of seals she remembered from the patent office. The signature had the right flourish but the wrong pressure. Someone had affixed a different cylinder to a practiced hand. She was not supposed to notice that. No one expected her to. Yet she had been trained to see details. The same attentiveness that allowed an engineer to judge a silicon microstructure by a subtle change in sheen was now parsing ink and indentation. The brass, when she set it beside the file and pressed, gave back a mark that was similar but not identical. It was a small thing, a minutia that would look like nothing to most people. It was everything to someone trying to build a case. The board was on edge. Guming's face, normally a mask of unruffled complacency, showed cracks. The rumor of a possible legal challenge to the patent, some entity was claiming prior art, an earlier inventor, or a misassignment, moved through the room like cold wind. If the patent were to be called into question, the IPO would wobble. Underwriters would pull back, journalists would circle. In private, Sue began to work differently. The things she had learned in university labs, how to organize data, how to keep logs, what makes proof believable, became a tool for emergency. She started collecting what she could without anyone knowing she was doing it. Not because she wanted war, but because truth, in a room of people who dealt an image, required evidence. She went back, at night, to the apartment where, before marriage, she had kept a shoebox of notebooks and a flash drive labeled with a childish exclamation. The notebooks smelled faintly of solder and lemon oil from the tools she'd once used for polishing. They contained hand-scrawled diagrams, tabs of equations, and, tucked between pages, a printout dated earlier than any of the corporate files that claimed ownership of DSPS. Her own notes, her own early prototypes, a timestamp that placed idea before commercialization. Fushikin, quiet, infuriatingly steady, brought her contacts without making them a spectacle. He connected her with an old colleague who owed her a favor, a patent clerk who remembered a particular case because an intern had made a mistake that week and had been quietly berated for it. The clerk, the sort who hoarded memos like pinpricks of truth, told Sue that there had been a reassignment form with handwriting that did not belong to the official listed as the transfer's signatory. The clerk's voice was small on the phone but felt enormous to Sue. "You should be careful," the clerk said. "People who do that, forge that kind of document, don't do it for small reasons." She was careful. She was precise. She made copies. She collected emails. She had, over years she would not admit to anyone, kept backups of design files on a private server she had called her archive. When she unboxed an old test board and held it up to the light, she could see the solder joints she had made too tight one winter when her hands had been freezing. A technical fingerprint. A minute detail, but one that could be traced back to the code comments and the commit logs she had kept in a personal repository with her nickname, Yuani, embedded in the metadata. Her life had been split, two names for the same person. To the world she had been the dutiful wife. In the lab she had been Yuani, an engineer who wrote explanatory comments for the next person who would read her work. The metadata in the files used that name more than once. It was a breadcrumb trail she had never meant anyone else to find. And yet it was now the only way to prove what she knew, that the technology others claimed as the company's own bore stamps of her hand, and the small idiosyncrasies only an original creator would make. She did not shout the discovery, she archived it, she cross-checked. She had learned that the rush to act without verification is the most common fatal error. The underwriters would need solid proof, The patent office needed evidence. The stock market needed a story with an ending, and endings are cruelly slow when the world is ruled by deadline-driven analysts and bored columnists. Meanwhile, in the social theater of their life, the in-laws escalated. A birthday banquet for a cousin turned into a tribunal. Gooming's sister, lacquered and pointed, made a show of presenting Sue with a gift for being generous. An ornate jewelry box with a ruby bracelet inside, meant as a public reward for being the dutiful wife and, not so subtly, a reminder that jewelry could be given and taken. The bracelet looked beautiful on the table under a chandelier. An empty chair waited for Sue to put it on. She did not. She left the banquet early, the ruby glinting like a threat in a pocket of gossip. They tried to strip her of assets. They claimed premarital agreements, waved clauses like flags. A legal notice arrived instructing her to vacate the marital home on the grounds of an internal disputed ownership designation. A second letter asked her to hand over certain electronic devices for forensic review. They treated possession like guilt. When the men in suits came to the house with a court order they thought was ironclad, she invited them in, let them take inventory, let them photocopy and photograph. The seal on their order looked neat. The official at the door, who had once admired one of Gooming's speeches, treated her with the polite reserve of someone on the correct side of credibility. He left the sealing stamp impression on the inventory sheet like a signature of a system that believed in its own righteousness. Outside, in the courtyard, Gooming let his anger be the hint of masculine wrath that threatened to tip into something worse. He offered, in private messages intercepted by a nosy niece and later leaked, an exchange of properties for her silence. "There are ways to settle this without show," he had written. "Consider the children's name. Consider the family name." She thought of the baby in the hospital again, of the tiny fist, and realized that some things belonged to the world and some to people. Whoever the mother was, she did not owe any more service. The war of possession felt foreign and obscene. She was not fighting for a seat at his table. She was fighting for the recognition of a labor they all claimed to own. Then the strangest thing happened. A parcel arrived at her management store, a thin commercial envelope with a notice that made the building seem unmoored. It was from a patent office abroad, a formal inquiry about possible prior art connected to DSPS. Its language was careful, bureaucratic. It was not a strike, but a probe. It meant that a reviewer somewhere saw something that required extra attention. It meant that a larger process had been initiated. It also meant that the market might look at DSPS with new scrutiny. Underwriters began to ask more questions. Analysts sent their team with probes shaped like polite sentences, but edged with the kind of suspicion that makes share prices waver. He tried to manage the narrative. He called a press conference and smiled with a hand forced to show compassion for his family's difficulties. He gave a speech about focus and corporate resilience in the same breath that he delivered barbs to the woman who had filed for divorce. He thought the economy of image could buy him time. But time is sometimes an enemy of well-laid image. If someone could show, with documents and dates and metadata, that the work inside DSPS bore another's fingerprints, then that underwriter call would become an account in which someone else has withdrawn what he thought he owned. She did two things quietly over the next 2 months. The first was practical. She liquidated an asset he had assumed was untouchable. The house which they had shared, advertised in wedding photos, staged for a family, was sold in her name through a corporate transfer that her lawyers had structured to be legally clean. She had been offered a sliver of autonomy in the form of a check, but the sale was not about money, it was about control. She wanted that house off the map of family leverage, gone from the space where her in-laws left notes and photographs and where their expectations were wallpapered on rooms. The sale made them squirm. They had expected her to tear from the papers with wailing and pleading. Instead, she signed the deed and watched the ink dry like someone witnessing the sunset on a life she would not return to. The second thing was more subtle. She started building a narrative thread that could withstand scrutiny. She reached out to one of her old lab professors, a woman who had a reputation for being uncompromisingly honest and who had been, in quieter times, her only ally to say that Yuani's work had real merit. The professor, when given the files and the metadata, agreed to write a signed statement about the originality of the designs and the usual markers of an engineer's authorship. It was not a sensational act. It was a professional's confirmation, dry and unromantic, but legally meaningful. Word traveled, not as a roar, but as an accumulation of small authoritative noises. A researcher at a rival startup posted a terse blog noting the unusual echo of code comments across a public repository and the corporate DSPS codebase. An independent journalist, who had become less interested in celebrity marriages and more in the interplay between tech and image, published a piece very carefully titled "To Question Authorship, Not to Convict." The story had the shape of caution now, and the market listened, always alert to caution. There were small retaliations. A well-placed anonymous tip to a regulatory board suggested irregularities in the account books. A civil petition threatened to freeze some of her assets on a technicality. The husband used the channels he had collaborated to build to attempt to block moves she made. He assumed she would flee or flinch. He was wrong. Markets move on narrative and evidence. Jingian learned to be a patient narrator. She sat with the facts she had. The notebooks, the metadata, the clerk's memory, the legal statements. She began to prepare the paper trail a professional needed, a neat, almost obsessive map of dates and design decisions, corroborated where possible by colleagues who owed her honest truths. She was assembling a case the way an engineer assembles a prototype, every joint tested, every connection verified. At the edge of her planning was another thing she could not predetermine: the human cost. The tabloids would chew on little shreds of her life. Some people would write that she was vengeful. Others would call her selfish. The Gu family would dine in new dishes, their gossip served fresh with tea. She accepted the minor cruelties because she had calculated the greater cruelty. A life lived to service someone else's hunger for status until the person inside you no longer recognized your hands. One night, after printing out 10 years of emails and past commit logs, she lay the stack on her small rented table and, for the first time in months, allowed herself to breathe. The pile smelled faintly of toner and the kind of tired paper that means work has been done. She took a moment to remember the first time she had soldered two leads together. The thrill when current finally moved through a circuit. The sensation of light translating into meaning, that was what had always driven her. It had never had to be famous to be true. Outside, the city hummed. Guming's office windows glowed on a top floor of the tower he had helped fill with his name. Someone had sent him a photograph of the family's banquet the week prior. He had smiled into the camera as if nothing was wrong. But poisoned currents had begun to corrode the shiny veneer. A compliance officer had mentioned in an offhand comment that the underwriters were starting to insist on original documentation for the patent assignment. A small back-office clerk had filed an official request to review the DSPS copyright because of the alleged prior art claim abroad. Actions that, on paper, looked perfectly routine were scaffolding the very moment when the market might want a different story. She was ready to make certain moves. She had not yet revealed herself in public as Yuani. She had told nobody in a press release that she was the hand that had shaped the product's earliest code. But she had traces and witnesses, and a patient willingness to let the truth align like light through a prism. She had learned to let systems work in her favor, to use their bureaucracies like a surgeon uses clamps. A soft knock on her door interrupted that night's reverie. It was Fushikin. He had the quiet steadiness of someone who had been allowed to love from a distance. He carried nothing but a thermos and 2 plain cups, but his arrival felt like a small tide turning. "You look like you slept badly," he observed, setting the cups on the table without asking. "You look like someone who has waited," she answered. He sat and took the cup without ceremony. Outside, a neighbor's television played a show where strangers complained about designers and designers denied the work. "You did the right thing," he said after an hour of small talk had measured itself out. "You didn't shout. You didn't make his life a spectacle. You collected facts. That's the right kind of anger." There was compassion in the way he said it, not pity. That mattered. She had been given so much pity in her marriage that it felt like a weapon. It had been a phrase used to bind her in place. In Fushikin's voice there was no binding, only steady regard. That night she lay awake and felt the shape of what she was about to do settle in her chest like an order. She had made decisions that upset the balance of things. Selling the house, assembling evidence, pushing back when she had been expected to bow. She was not naive about consequences. She expected mud. She expected to be reduced in columns and to be told that a woman who was not smiling was obscene. She expected loneliness. but she also expected to be honest. On a weekday, an email came through to her private account from a legal team working for underwriters. A meaningfully cautious message. They were gathering paperwork. They wanted authorizations to access originating documentation for the technology. It was not a subpoena. It was an opening. The wheels were turning. Across the city, the DSPS ticker, if it had existed, would have twitched. Quiet things had patterns. A request here, a rumor there, an analyst's footnote. None of them were detonations. They were small knocks that, when combined, would become a sound the market could not ignore. Sue got up and walked to the window. Below, a courier biked past with a box for someone who had ordered something impulsive. The city moved in its indifferent way. On the sill, a tiny glass bell, a trinket from a banquet years ago, waited. She picked it up and rang it once, a private sound that carried no public meaning. She ran her fingers over its brass. The seal, the stamp, the motifs that had shaped her life were in her hands now, as objects of memory, not of ownership. She knew what the next steps would be. She knew that exposure required more than a handbag of accusations. It required legal patience and technical clarity. She also knew that when the bell of the market rang, when the exchange opened and underwriters called, when the cameras arrived and the patient file she had assembled met the curious eyes of regulators, there would be no going back to the woman who had served a stranger's baby and smiled. An envelope arrived the following morning, heavier than the usual mail. The seal on it was unfamiliar and official-looking. She opened it with hands that were steady. Inside was a notice from a foreign patent review board acknowledging receipt of a request to examine DSPS for possible prior art. The language was neutral, but the implication was volatile. Someone had filed a claim that could, if validated, change ownership narratives. She sat down, letting the paper rest on her lap, and for the first time allowed a small smile, neither cruel nor triumphant, but the simple exhalation of a long mindset loosening. There would be fights ahead, legal wrangling, PR skirmishes, family barbs. He would beg. She did not know what words he would use when the begging came. Apologies, offers, pleas. She did not yet know whether she would accept them. That was not hers to decide today. She had one more thing to do before the city had the chance to form an opinion. There was a test rig in a storage unit she had rented under a friend's name, an aging laptop with a screen that had seen better days and a backup drive labeled with the nickname no one in her married life used. She drove there in a borrowed car, keys shoved in the pocket of a coat that no longer matched the image she had worn to so many dinners. She hooked the drive to the laptop and watched lines of code scroll by. There, amidst header comments and test logs, were traces. Her traces. A variable name she always used that mirrored a childhood nickname. An offhand joke in a comment about choosing resistors that only a person with a specific memory of an old workshop would make. These were the kinds of things professional reviewers noticed and took seriously because they were improbable to be forged. The metadata showed earlier timestamps than the corporate file. The logs matched the dates she had jotted in a notebook in a dormitory far away from any boardroom. She copied everything, encrypted it, stamped backup copies at 2 different cloud locations using anonymous credentials. It was the work of someone who had spent too many nights defending prototypes and learning how to think like a reviewer. She did not post the files. She prepared them. When she left, the city smelled like rain, clean and invigorating. She sat in the driver's seat for a long time and allowed herself a moment of pure, unstructured thought. The counting in her head slipped back into place, but it was no longer a vow to endure. It was, instead, a rhythm for action. One day she'd been the woman who handed bowls. The next she would be the woman who asked the world to look closely. Moving pieces would shift, seals would be examined, signatures compared, hearings scheduled. Some people would say she was reckless, others would call her brave. She did not need the labels. She only needed the truth. It was, after all, the only currency that could not easily be counterfeited. A text arrived as she was unlocking the car. A single line from an unknown number that read, simply, "They're going to ring the bell next week." No signature. A tremor of adrenaline ran down her spine. The bell, their market ritual, would be rung in full view of the world in 8 days. The IPO ceremony where the chairman would stand before cameras and ring the exchange bell in triumph. She laughed softly, the sound a little sharp in the empty car. In that laugh was the shape of what was to come, a public stage, a private truth, and the delicate anatomy of a plan that would expose the seams. She closed her phone and placed it in the glove compartment. Then she drove away from the tower, whose glass reflected a man who assumed every story would bend toward him. On the passenger seat lay a small notebook with a single entry at the top, written in tidy ink: "Prepare, document, wait." Her reflection passed the window for a moment, someone tired, someone fierce. The counting in her head hit 1,000 again, not as a vow to stay, but as a marker of how far she had come. Outside, the city kept its perfect indifferent rhythm. Inside her chest, something tightened into purpose. She would not be the woman who simply served anymore. She had the documents, the memories, and the patience required for a bureaucracy to do what it does, reveal truth in the language it understood, paperwork, dates, and signatures. She was no longer just Jingian. She was someone with a name she had not spoken in years, a name that would matter soon enough. She had given 3 years to a marriage that expected a lifetime of silence. In return, she had found a reason to stop being silent. Before night fell, she called the number she had kept for emergencies and left a message at a number she had known for a decade. "If they ring the bell," she said, "be ready." There was no flourish, no cinematic close, only a plan forming, hands steady, and the sound of a city that would soon hear a different bell. She had left the message and then sat very still, as if waiting for a tremor to pass through the room. The city did not tremble. It went on, indifferent. The bell would ring in 8 days. That was a schedule the market did not negotiate. Before dawn the next morning, an email flagged on her private account. An underwriter's assistant asking for an expedited verification of origins. The subject line was careful, neutral. The body of the note, however, carried the weight of possibility. Someone on the other side of the table wanted the facts, clean, ordered, undeniable. She called the patent clerk who had whispered a hint weeks before. He was not a dramatic man. His world was forms and dates and the small satisfactions of a job done without fanfare. When she explained what she had assembled, he did not gasp. He did not say, "Of course." He said, "Bring everything. Make copies." That was the kind of certainty she needed. By noon that day, she was moving like an apparatus finely tuned to its purpose. A storage unit, a borrowed truck, a friend who could drive and never asked why the boxes were heavy with notebooks and old circuit boards. She felt like a person about to reassemble a long disassembled engine. Each piece had a place, each screw could be tracked back to a batch number, papers stacked into neat folders, electronics zipped into anti-static bags. She labeled metadata in ways only an engineer could love. Dates, commit hashes, version numbers. The obsession with order was not perfectionism, it was protection. Fushikin appeared not as a rescuer, but as an ally with small, effective habits. He never made a show of his resources, he simply provided the right person at the right moment. A cybersecurity forensics analyst, recommended through a mutual old colleague, arrived bearing a laptop and 2 thermoses of coffee. He did not treat her like an aggrieved wife or a heroine in a film. He treated her like the author of a code base who had come to shore up her claim. They worked late into a Thursday night. The analyst ran scripts and compared checksums. He looked past the corporate gloss and into the raw evidence. Metadata matched her handwriting, not metaphorically, but literally. The file timestamps corresponded with her time logs. The compiler comments contained the same idiosyncratic phrasing she had used in her notebooks years before. One small variable name, the one she had given to the first test loop after a dormitory joke, appeared in an earlier commit on a personal repository long before DSPS existed as a brand. To the analyst, these were the kind of fingerprints that forensic teams respect. "These aren't random," he said, not because he wanted to dramatize, but because the facts did. "They're pattern-based. Someone who wrote this would likely have been involved in the architecture phase." That evening, Sue listened as technical language confirmed what her memory already knew. The proof did not sing. It spoke in a practiced monotone. When she heard the analyst's verdict, she allowed herself a fraction of relief, a tiny fissure in a months-long pressure, as the small team cross-checked notebooks with commits and assembled printouts for what would be a formal submission. The city's rumor mill did what rumor mills always do. It multiplied the smallest noises into a chorus. A gossip column ran a sketch of the banquet where she had declined the ruby bracelet, subtly implying ingratitude. Her in-laws tightened their posture. Guming, who had once addressed scandal with the breezy charm of a man who believed perception could substitute for reality, began to show thinner shirts in the office of the chairman. His handlers, press agents, and legal counsel started to move in predictable ways. Press statements emphasized the strength of the leadership team and robust compliance frameworks. His lawyers sent a letter through a third party, threatening to sue for defamation if anyone repeated the unfounded accusations circulating in smaller forums. The board, teetering between loyalty and fiduciary panic, held private sessions. They wanted calm. Calm was a currency the market still honored. On the day of the scheduled regulatory inquiry, Sue walked into a room that smelled of expensive coffee and fluorescent light. The underwriter's legal counsel wore the kind of face that had handled many unpleasant things without blinking. He thanked her for being thorough and then asked questions the way a person counts out money. "Can you provide original media with intact metadata?" he asked. "Yes," she answered simply, and slid the encrypted drive across the table. Her voice did not tremble. It was the voice of someone who had soldered wire at 1 in the morning and, having fixed a fault, knew precisely which heat rose at which temperature. The lawyers and analysts, some hired by the underwriters, some by the patent office, worked through the day. When she recounted the sequence of developments, the lab notes, the dorm commit, the printouts from the clerk who had kept memos, the room's temperature did not change, but the posture of those around her did. People who had considered this a private family scandal began treating it like a potential legal liability. That shift in the room was as important as any document. It meant other actors now had an incentive to act not for loyalty, but for risk mitigation. Guming learned that day that networks have edges, and edges fray. He called her. She let it go to voicemail. In the message, he sounded measured, a practiced contrition catching at the edges. "Come back," he said. "We can manage this, for the family's sake." The word family landed in her ears like a bartered coin. She did not answer. Instead, she walked to the exchange's administrative office with 2 printed notebooks and a USB drive containing a disk image and a manifest. An official there took the material and, after a look that read as neutral as a person trained to process claims, agreed to forward the documents to the registry for patent claims review. The exchange's legal counsel requested a formal submission. The underwriters asked for clarification. The market, which trades on day-to-day confidence, started to itch. The other side did not remain idle. Guming's team, panicked, started to look for quick fixes. They found them in public relations, crafted statements about internal miscommunications, and contributions by a broad research team. A hastily organized press kit portrayed DSPS as the product of a collective lab, diminishing the significance of any single author. It was a plausible story. Collective authorship is common and believable, but it did not explain certain timestamps and those odd metadata fingerprints. The Gu family, sensing a shift in which their son might be being pulled under by scandal, convened behind closed doors. The mother-in-law's voice had the brittle edge of someone who had spent decades translating propriety into leverage. They proposed a settlement, money, a quiet retraction, public statements about amicable terms. Their safe world was based on keeping noise below a threshold where social discomfort could be mediated by gifts and social rearrangements. She refused. The refusal itself became a smaller story in tabloids. No mercy or rightful defense? And in the rooms where people sipped wine and made moral judgments. But in the legal rooms where documents mattered, a different story was building. Her submissions were placing pressure on the underwriters and the patent reviewers. 8 days after the anonymous text, IPO day, Guming walked onto a stage in front of a ribbon of cameras, tuxedo impeccable, smile measured. The exchange's bell gleamed beneath his palm. Bannered logos proclaimed a future of growth and transformation. Board members basked in warm light. The ritual had been planned for months. The bell meant validation, a public ritual that would convert private valuation into traded value. It was precisely the moment he planned to walk through as the man who had made the company prosper. What he had not accounted for was the momentum bureaucracy can achieve once triggered. A junior analyst at an international patent board, responding to the submission that referenced prior art, had filed an emergency note to the exchange's compliance division asking whether there had been any recent filings that might pose material implications. Their email reached the exchange legal counsel, who, interested in everything that might affect listing conditions, pinged the underwriters. The underwriters in turn paused. That pause, an administrative hesitation, arrived in the middle of the bell ceremony. Just as the chairman raised his hand, an exchange official approached the stage with a tablet and an unreadable expression. In the audience, the cameras continued to roll. A hedge fund manager in the fifth row set his coffee down more slowly than usual. When the exchange counsel gently signaled that the bell could not be rung, the cameras noticed. On television, there was a beat of silence. The chairman's hand hovered like a conductor whose orchestra had suddenly hit an unexpected chord. The exchange had the authority, under certain listing rules, to delay a company's first trade if potential material misrepresentations were brought to light in proximity to the listing. That authority is not used lightly, but when risk and optics collide, administrators prefer caution. The pause became a lasting moment. Reporters started to speak in rapid, urgent sentences. Live social feeds lit up. "Listing delayed pending review," read the first headlines. Market algorithms, designed to detect hesitation, began to flag potential volatility. A trader in Beijing saw an alert and sold a small stake. The sale rippled through order books elsewhere. Guming, stunned, turned to his counsel. His smile cracked into surprise, then a flash of panic that he tried to hide. He stepped off the stage and retreated to the boardroom, where phones began to ring incessantly. PR teams spun out statements, calling the delay prudent and temporary, while their legal teams scrambled to keep an already tense narrative within controllable bounds. Across the city, Sue watched the live feed in a cafe with Fushikin. No triumph in her face, only an odd, quiet steadiness. The bell did not ring. The market breathed out. For the first time in months, the world had watched the ritual pull back. For Guming, the days that followed were a calculus of desperation. He attempted a variety of maneuvers that ranged from plausible to petty. He tried to coax board members with promises of structural change. He leaked stories of supposed co-conspirators to muddy the provenance question. He insisted that the company's in-house counsel could handle the issue. In quieter moments, he reached out to intermediaries who might smooth over the patent review. At home, his messages became messier. There were offers more sincere-sounding and others that felt like bargaining. Assets, joint statements, a chance to return and save face. In one message that was later leaked, he offered to place the company in a blind trust if she would issue a corrective statement about the origins of DSPS. The demand came with an undertone she recognized. He assumed the right to reshape the past and her to rewrite herself in public. She would not. The bargain required her to disavow her own work. That was not a transaction she was willing to make. The legal processes moved slowly enough to feel like frustration and fast enough to leave people scrambling. The Patent Office issued a provisional hold on the corporate assignment pending investigation. The underwriters told the exchange they needed more time to review origination material. Stock markets, fed on rumor and scheduling, punished the uncertainty with sideways moves that contracted into a tidy drop the third day after the postponed bell. It was not a collapse yet, but the company's valuation slumped into a zone where confidence is thin and predators prowl. Guming responded in the only way he knew that was still performative, by trying to command narrative. A live press conference, webcast to the same watchers who'd seen him pause at the bell, was organized in 48 hours. He stood before a podium and spoke of resilience and transparency. Near his elbow, his legal team had supplied a short deck of bullet points that framed DSPS as the product of collective innovation, and argued that any authorship dispute was a private matter that did not affect technical validity. They expected confusion to blunt scrutiny. Instead, on social platforms and in the analyst community, people demanded evidence. The public is less patient when information is charged to a corporate narrative. They asked for timelines, for source files, for testimony. Journalists began combing public code repositories for corroboration and found the traces she had discreetly left in the open months before. One reporter, in particular, became a crucial amplifier. Lei Han had a reputation for careful reporting and an interest in the way technology and power intersect. She dug into the filing and interviewed Sue under the promise of off-the-record clarity about technical provenance. Sue did not appear in a splashy exposé. She gave Lei the notebooks, the metadata, and a measured narrative that laid out facts without melodrama. Lei published the piece with restraint, precise dates, quotes from the patent clerk, comments from Sue's former professor confirming the early authorship markers. The piece circulated. Analysts who had been leaning on the company for stable signals began to revise their assessments. Funds marked down exposure until the matter cleared. Regulators who had been passive now called for forensic audits. Public sentiment, which had initially allowed Guming to be the face of success, shifted towards skepticism. Not everyone reacted with fairness. There were personal attacks, op-eds that suggested a woman who demanded recognition was somehow unbecoming. The Gu family issued statements about respectability and privacy, and in public dinners the mother-in-law spoke of family wounds and urged calm reflection. But small authoritative noises, those from professors, from the clerk, from the forensics team, kept building. Their dryness fortified her claim. When official auditors finally reported preliminary findings, the news was a ledger of imprecision and forgery. The report did not use melodramatic adjectives. It used terms like inconsistent seal impressions and document reassignment lacking standard procedural witnesses. It called for a formal criminal inquiry into potential falsification of patent assignment documents. The weight of legal language does not make headlines the way scandal does, but in the rooms where capital is allocated, legal language moves markets. Guming called again, this time without the practiced veneers. He demanded a private meeting, said he could fix reputational corrections quietly if she would attend. He offered money, offers to sign public affidavits, to cede certain ceremonial roles to her in return for legal denials of wrongdoing. His desperation took a tone that bared the calculation. Possessions could still be bartered for silence. She gave him one meeting, partly to prove to herself that she could stand in his presence without dissolving, partly to watch him. He arrived ringed by advisers and the faint smell of cologne that must have cost more than 100 dinners. He tried flattery, nostalgia, and finally bargaining. He spoke of the children he said he wanted to protect, and appealed to the social myth that two parents are necessary for legibility of family. It was performative. Whether he meant it or not did not matter. The offer required her to discard truth for comfort. When he begged, his voice broke in ways he did not intend. He offered any of the old bargains: money, shared control, the wink of social arrangement. He even suggested they could reconcile publicly, a staged reunion to restore shareholder faith. It was, in many ways, the oldest sort of ask: rewrite the past in exchange for future calm. She listened. The counting she had practiced in the taxi returned, but it had lost its old meaning. The numbers were no longer a promise to endure. They were a measure of endurance itself. She had given 3 of those years to being small for someone else. She would not trade everything she had become for the comforting architecture of an old life. No, she said quietly. It was short, simple, and absolute. He had not expected it to be so unembellished. No, she repeated, watching the way his face crumpled between anger and disbelief. Word of the refusal leaked, as such things do, into gossip circles. But it did not matter. The formal mechanisms moved faster now. The company's board convened an emergency session to consider temporary leadership adjustments. The regulators opened inquiries. The markets reacted. Shares slid further as investors reassessed legal risk and possible criminal exposure. The chairman, who had once been photographed by glossy cameras, now found himself the subject of sober financial radio shows and legal commentary panels. In private, he tried different strategies: threats thinly veiled beneath legalese, bribes disguised as settlements, and finally a plea that resting on a show of contrition would suffice. Each option required her to repaint herself into someone she was no longer willing to be. Her victory was not sudden. It was bureaucratic and procedural, a series of small doors closing in sequence because evidence had weight. The Foreign Patent Board issued a formal request for the original assignment documents to be notarized and presented with witnesses. The inconsistency in stamps and the clerk's testimony aligned into a pattern. Forensic analysis of the signature, naturally a complicated and slow matter, began to suggest that a forged instrument had been used to shift rights. In the middle of this slow-motion collapse, Guming sent a voice message that betrayed the man he had been at his most honest, not charming, not bullying, panicked. "Come back," he implored. "If you do this, I will lose everything. We can save it together." The word everything was not only about money, it was about an identity he had built on ownership and image. She thought of the baby she had once fed, and the perfumed handkerchief in the hospital bed. She thought of the nights coding alone, the solder burns that had been invisible on a wedding night photograph. She thought of the professor who had written dryly, in measured terms, that the work had a voice that belonged to a single mind at its origin. When she finally replied to his message, she wrote only, "No, I will not be yours to prop up." Then, just as official pressure mounted, Fushikin made a move that shook even Sue. He proposed something that was not theatrical, but surgical. A legal marriage in private, quick and without fanfare, designed to change certain standing in the social and legal chessboard. His family influence could create a protective buffer. People would think twice before seizing at a woman who had the backing of another powerful family. It was practical and designed for a moment. Not romance, but strategy. He explained it clearly. It would protect her from certain civil maneuvers the Gu family might try, and it would show the public that she had options besides returning to a man who had tried to coerce her into silence. She paused at the proposal because it required her to enter into another contract, another public label, but she was tired of the transactional nature of love and more tired still of being the object of family bargaining. What Fushikin offered was different. Partnership without theatrical demands. He wanted to help, but also to be close. Her first instinct was caution. Then she thought about leverage, about practicalities. The law in their jurisdiction would not be rewritten by marriage, but public alliances are sometimes as potent as legal bars. When power is in the hands of those who can sway opinion and shield one from petty legal harassment, protection has real value. They married quietly 2 days before a scheduled evidentiary hearing in a municipal registry where a clerk stamped papers and did not ask about the backstory. It was as simple as paperwork can be. No grand announcement. A photograph or two leaked later. An image of 2 people at a desk, smiles small and practical. The public read layers into it they were not entitled to. Some praised her for moving on, others suspected manipulation. She did not care what the crowd said. The marriage gave her a strategic edge and a friend who became something more complicated over late-night strategy talks. The hearing itself was a slow thing that unspooled legal detail into public record. Her attorney presented compiled evidence, primary notebooks, commit logs, corroborating statements from the patent clerk and the professor, and the forensic analyst's findings about metadata and signature inconsistencies. Witnesses testified about timelines, and the auditor presented a chart of document movements. It was dry but damning. The board's counsel, once accustomed to polishing smiles for the camera, folded. At the end of a long day, the exchange's compliance division announced a provisional halt on the listing and recommended referral to prosecutors for potential document forgery. The markets reacted quickly. The company's valuation dropped more severely as institutional confidence eroded. The cascade was methodical, not cataclysmic, yet the humiliation for a man who had built his public image on being infallible was severe. When the public investigators called Guming in, he finally understood the depth of his predicament. In custody rooms where lawyers usually calibrated the precise tone of denial and contrition, his voice sounded smaller. He asked once desperately for her to speak on his behalf. He offered to resign to mitigate criminal consequences. He promised to sign anything she wanted in return for one public exoneration. He begged in messages, in voicemail, in a private legal meeting where desperation loosened the careful armor he had worn. He crouched at dignity's edge, offering her crumbs of the old world if she would only nod them back into being his. She did not. There was a point where dignity and justice were not interchangeable, where to accept his plea would have been to erase what she had done. She had built, over months, a case not simply to win against a person, but to correct an injustice that had been institutionalized by those who valued image over truth. He begged too late. The public reaction was complicated. Some people saw him as a man fallen from grace and pitied him. Others condemned him. Her own victory felt complicated too. No giddy crowing, no triumphant dance. It was relief mixed with the emptiness that follows a long, hard fight. She had to reckon with what the fight cost her. Nights alone, the tabloid chatter that had pierced friends and allies, the knowledge that some relationships could never be repaired. The final legal findings took months, as they always do. Evidence was pored over. Signatures were compared under magnification. The court examined the chain of custody of documents. When the final administrative determination favored her claim, the DSPS assignment flagged for re-evaluation and the case referred for criminal investigation, many of those who had assumed the company's narrative found their certainty shaken. The Patent Office issued a re-examination order and an interim note acknowledging the possibility of misassignment. It was not the swift justice of a headline, it was the procedural ruling that slowly resets ownership claims. With that formal shift, corporate governance shifted as well. The board, shamed and fearful of continuing liability, installed an interim leadership team and began a transparent audit. The man who had once been chairman was now subject to inquiries, stripped of the sheen of ceremonial privilege. The company's IPO remained postponed indefinitely. The stock price, which had been inflated by expectation, found a lower, more realistic level while investigations continued. Sue's name began to circulate in tech circles not as a scandal figure, but as the author of an important piece of engineering. Her professor wrote a short note to a technical journal acknowledging the early designs, and a small yet influential tech forum published a thread demolishing the old narrative that had attributed DSPS to others. In a quiet ceremony at a research institute some months later, Sue was invited to speak at a symposium about authorship and ethics in engineering. She accepted, not as a triumph, but as an opportunity to shift how institutions honor creators. The Gu family retreated into their private rituals, their gossip replaced by quieter fears about social doors closing. The mother-in-law never quite regained the posture of unquestioned authority in the same social circles. They had once treated marriage and dowry as a currency. They had, for a time, forgotten the cost when that currency is questioned by a rule-bound world. In her personal life, the marriage to Fushikin gradually became more than strategic shelter. He was not dramatic in romance. He was patient, the kind of person who showed up with tea when the nights were long and proof needed organizing. He did not offer grand speeches. Instead, he listened without the impulse to fix everything with money or public statements. He helped curate her archive, sat quietly as she explained technical nuances to journalists, and understood, without envy, her desire for a future not built on appearances. They spent nights walking through empty parks, counting steps for different reasons now, sometimes out of habit, sometimes to rehearse a future where they might measure their days by the small joys they allowed each other. The 1,000 that once marked a vow of endurance had shifted. Now it became a symbol of how far she had come and the choice not to endure wrongs for the sake of keeping up appearances. She opened a small consultancy, quiet, intentionally modest, that advised young engineers on authorship protection and the ethics of intellectual property. She refused offers to start a flashy new company that would trade in headlines. Her aim was pedagogical and structural. She wanted to change the small processes that allowed credit to be erased in favor of spectacle. Students arrived with notebooks that reminded her of her younger self. She taught them not just about design but about documentation, the mundane, bureaucratic things that protect creative labor. The press, predictably, returned at intervals. There were profile pieces and late-night commentators who parsed every nuance of the case. She read some of it and ignored most. What mattered were the things no headline could capture: the sense of being recognized by an old colleague, the quiet letters from former students who said she had changed the way they thought about work and credit, the simple pleasure of writing code where people knew the author's name and respected it. Guming's life took on other difficulties. He faced legal consequences, corporate inquiries, an investigation into document handling, and a social reputation that, for a man whose power depended on certainty, had been made uncertain. He made public statements about accountability and reformation. He sought counseling, and for a while his messages were routed through lawyers. He would, on occasion, send a note. "I am sorry for what has happened." She acknowledged them with a nod from afar, and when necessary, with legal counsel. Empathy did not mean a return to the old arrangement. It meant recognizing that a man who had once demanded obedience now faced a different reckoning. In the final public confrontation between them, at a regulatory hearing months after the bell that had never been rung, he rose to speak and his voice was thin. "I have wronged people," he said, not in theatrical terms, but in a way that sounded like a man cataloguing the trail of consequences his ambition had left. She listened to him. She did not stand to reprimand, nor did she gloat. She had gone through something harsher than his public apology. She had built herself back from being reduced by others. When the hearing ended and the cameras retreated, she and Fushikin walked out into the afternoon sun, not under spotlights, but with a quiet street between them. The ruby bracelet her mother-in-law once presented as a symbol of transactional gratitude remained in a box somewhere. The bell at the exchange remained unstruck for DSPS. The seal motif, once used to affirm forged paper, now felt small against the work she had done to document authorship. There were small human reconciliations. Friends who had hesitated during the scandal apologized. Some relationships had broken beyond repair. She accepted what was honest and let the rest go. She had found in the process that public victory could still leave private wounds. Repair is slow. The consultancy flourished modestly. Young engineers came to her with questions about authorship disputes. She taught them to keep logs, to timestamp commits, to secure their creative work. The professional recognition she had fought to earn was quieter than expected, but steadier. Invitations to speak at conferences replaced the tabloid's intrusive messages. Her name, which had been contested in public, settled into being associated with work rather than gossip. In quiet moments she still counted, not to measure endurance, but to measure deliberate steps. She and Fushikin, newly married for practical reasons that had grown into something warmer, would sometimes walk and count the small things that meant the most. 1, he would say, handing her a cup of tea. 2, she would reply, and they would smile because counting had become a private language of mutual care rather than a ledger of sacrifice. On a late autumn evening, in the apartment they had chosen together, pared down, full of second-hand books and practical furniture, Sue sat at a small table and found an envelope she had kept since the first weeks of her fight. Inside were copies of the early notebooks, neatly bound, with a note from her professor at the front, an acknowledgement of authorship and a lesson about ethics. She placed the book on the shelf next to a quiet photograph, her and Fushikin standing before a symposium podium, tired but steady. She picked up the tiny glass bell that had been a trinket on her old windowsill and rang it once, lightly. The sound was small and domestic. It no longer held the fantasy of an exchange bell. It was private, intimate. It was, in a way, the sound of closure. Outside their window, the city continued its indifferent life. There was no dramatic final reckoning on a front page. There were legal processes still working their way through, and Gooming faced consequences as a result of now public investigations. But for Sue, the victory had never been about ruin. It had been about recognition, about regaining the name she had hidden. Yuani. She had not sought to destroy a man but to assert the truth of her work in a world that often credits the loudest voice. Years later, a small plaque at a technical symposium would record her as Yuani Su Jingian, original author, DSPS architecture, and professors would point to her case in lectures about authorship. Students would ask her how she had remained steady. She would tell them about documentation and friends and counting, not as a moralizing tale, but as practical advice. "Keep your notes," she'd say, "log your work. And when you must fight, do it with the patience of someone who knows how to collect evidence." On the night the case closed to the degree it could, she sat opposite Fushikin and set down a bowl of simple, handmade porridge. No ritual need, only the calm of two people who had decided to care for one another without cost. He reached across the table and took her hand. They did not speak the grand words of novels. They spoke in small reassurances. "We made it this far. We will keep going." She counted quietly under her breath, not as a vow of silence but as a rhythm of living. When it reached 1,000, she smiled. This time, not because she had been asked to endure, but because she had chosen her steps. The 1,000 had become a measure of distance traveled and distance still possible. She had given 3 years to someone who wanted to buy her silence. She had gained the proof, the voice, and the agency to walk away. Outside, a small bell at the city's market rang twice, in no way connected to exchanges or IPOs, only the sound of ordinary trade. It was enough. She placed a new photograph on the shelf that night. Not a staged family portrait, but a candid capture of 2 people, weary and content, standing under street lamps. The ruby bracelet remained in its box, a relic of a transaction that no longer had power over her choices. He had begged. It had come late. Her answer had been a deliberation of facts and a quiet refusal. In the aftermath, she found recognition not as spectacle but as restored identity. Her story did not end with loud vindication. It settled into a steadier life, one where her name matched her work and where love was chosen rather than purchased. For more stories like this, deep dives into lives where quiet courage rewrites narratives, follow along. For now, she put her hands around a warm cup and listened to the small sounds of a life she had reclaimed. The bell, unstruck in exchange halls, would not define her. She would.